The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about America. So we haven't talked about America at all yet. We've been talking about Europe. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to talk about what was in America before the Spanish got here. And the way that we're going to understand the encounter between Europeans and Americans is by looking at the economics of it, right? The economics of colonization. The idea here is that uh, the way that Europeans um, behaved towards Americans was colored by what kind of a society, what kind of an economic society they lived in. All right. So just right off the front, we need to understand that the Europeans came to America to make a profit. All right. And depending on what kind of a society they found in America, depended on how they were going to make that profit. Okay. So so when we look at the Americas at the beginning, say, of the 16th century, we can see two different kinds of societies that have developed, and we're going to characterize them by either a surplus economy or a subsistence economy. And surplus economy means that they make uh, more than they need to live, that a certain group of the population is able to make more than is needed for everybody to live. So the surplus then goes to the top. And we'll talk about more in a second. In a subsistence economy, like a hunter gatherer society, right? Uh, these are people that basically wander around looking for foraging for food and hunting and things like that, and it has a very different social structure. So when the Spanish first came to America, they came to the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean islands, the natives there had a subsistence economy, and in a subsistence economy, everybody works to create enough for everybody to live, and so there's this basic equality that's built into a subsistence economy. Everybody is needed in order to produce enough for everybody to live, and that also means that everybody is engaged in producing what's needed to live. So nobody's really freed up to do other things. And what happens, and this happens everywhere. It doesn't happen just in America. It happens. It happened in Mesopotamia. It happened in China and Africa, and in Europe. And what happens is that at some point, this subsistence economy, this non-sedentary group, is going to access a source of food that will make it possible for them to settle. All right. So the reason why they've been moving around, they've been sedentary, they've been non-sedentary, they've been moving around, is because they needed to follow the food supply. But if they create a local food supply that they don't have to move to access, like planting corn or something like that, then they can stay in one place. And then once they start to stay in one place, then they will start to build um, structures, okay? And these structures, more permanent structures, like, houses, and then later, temples and other buildings like that, are going to, they essentially start to build cities, right? So the Greek word for city is kivis, right? And that's where we get our word civilization. So when we look at what we think, what in a technical term is civilization, it just means that people have organized to live in cities. It doesn't have a qualitative aspect like Europeans uh, have assigned to it. So often we think about, well, there's civilized people and then there's savages, right? And civilized people are good and savages are bad, right? Well, the reality is that there are people who have organized themselves to live in cities, and there are people who have not organized themselves to live in cities, and they don't have any. They're not. qualitatively different. You can't say one is good and the other is bad. It's just different. Okay. So at any rate, the point is that once they've settled down and they've started to build their cities, they are eventually what ends up happening is that um, they can that the people who are what happens is that the structure starts to stratify, meaning that instead of everybody being on the same level, certain people will be freed up to do other things. So this is actually a representation of what we call the Aztec social society, social hierarchy, although they didn't call themselves Aztecs, but we'll just let that go for now. But what happened was in the beginning, it was everybody creating enough for everybody to live. But after a while, the social society started to stratify, and so there were, like we can see at the time of the discovery, there were these different levels of society. There were at the bottom slaves who were sacrificed, and then slaves who worked, and then there's a group called Mayekis, who are like peasants. They're like kind of like campesinos today, or if you go, like when you go down to Home Depot and you see a bunch of people waiting for work, it's like that. Those would be the Mayekis. And then the Masequaltin are the craftsmen, the people who own their tools, and they work in the cities, and they actually have ownership in society. And it's these bottom four groups that will make enough that other people can pursue other pursuits, right? So the Posteca are going to be the merchants that will be traveling around. The Pupiltin are going to be the nobles and the warriors, the war leaders, and then at the top there's the Tlatoani, which is at the time of the um, at the time of the discovery of America, that was Montezuma the second. We call him Montezuma, and we think of him as the emperor, but it wasn't really an empire in the way that we would think about it. And I'll talk about that in a minute, right? So at any rate, when the Spanish came, they found one of these two kinds of societies, right? So the first one they found in the Caribbean was this kind, and then later they found this kind in Mexico, right? And then later in Peru. Okay, the question we want to ask ourselves is that if we're going to um, look for value, if I'm a European coming to America and I'm looking for a way to extract value, how will I do that? Where is the value located? All right. And if we look in this social structure, we have to ask ourselves, is the value in the people or is it in the land? What do you guys think?
It's going to be in the people.
Um, Keeping in mind that there's only enough produced for everybody to live, there's nothing left over, right? So if they're not making anything that's left over, then the people would not be a source of wealth, right? Instead, they would have to extract the wealth from the land. That would mean that rather than letting the people extract value because there isn't anything left over, then they use the land to extract value. And then what happens to the people? You don't need them anymore, right? So they'll be enslaved, or they'll be pushed out, or they will be killed. One of the things that we'll notice is that in the Caribbean, almost all of the native population was completely wiped out, right? Through disease and other things. It's not like they went on a killing spree or anything like that, but the whole population essentially was wiped out. And the only thing we remember of the Carib Indians is the name, the Caribbean, right? So at any rate, that's going to be the Spanish come to America. They find this area where they want to extract value. The only place they can extract value from is the land. So they move the people off the land, right? And they use the land for themselves. Okay. Now in this structure, this is a different structure because you have the bottom group making enough for everybody to live on, and then the top group is freed up. There's a surplus, right? So now, if we look at where are we going to find value in this society, is it in the people or is it in the land?
In the people.
In the people, because the people are producing value. Okay, so the Spanish strategy when they see these kinds of societies is to just cut off the top and put themselves up there, right? So in the beginning, the conquest of Mexico, Montezuma II was the emperor, the Tlatoani, the head, and all of the money went up to Montezuma. But but um, what happened was that the Montezuma was killed, and the Spanish theoretically put the King of Spain at the top, which means that all of the wealth that's being produced by the society will, instead of going to the nobles of the Aztecs, will go to the nobles of the Spanish. You follow what I'm saying? So now, one of the things that we'll notice is that um, if you're a Spaniard and you want to extract value, the destruction of the people in this bottom area is going to be really essential, right? But the destruction of the people here would be destructive of the source of wealth. It'd be like killing the goose that laid the golden egg, right? And so what that means is that the Spanish are going to be interested in maintaining this social structure, right? Because this social structure is producing wealth. If they destroy the social structure, they destroy the source of their wealth. You see what I'm saying? Well, the reason why this is important, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later today, is because when we think about the conquest of Mexico, we think of the bloodthirsty Spanish coming to America and wiping out all the Indians and taking their stuff, right? And in effect, that is what happened, but it wasn't what the Spanish intended. So something happened that caused a rapid and drastic decline in population that wasn't really initiated intentionally by the Spanish. What was that? What caused the Indians to die?
A disease?
Disease, exactly. The Europeans introduced diseases that the Spanish had no immunity to, and excuse me, that the natives had no immunity to, and that caused a rapid decline. And with that decline in population, we also see a collapse of this social structure, right? So in essence, the wealth producing machine is going to be killed off by the Spanish, but not intentionally. All right. Okay, let me just mention something else here. We use the word Indians. The reason why I use that word is because we know what we're talking about when we say Indians, but we also know that that the people who live in the Americas were not from India, right? So to say that everybody in North America is an Indian is like saying everybody from Belfast to Beijing is a Mexican, right? Okay, it's really inaccurate historically, right? Or genealogically, I guess you could say. But it is a word that we can use, that we can generalize a population that way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the course.